Plane disappearances have to be one of the creepiest types of cases. The fact that there have been huge aircrafts full of people that have seemingly vanished into thin air is incredibly unsettling, and it really makes you wonder if that next trip overseas is worth it. We're going to start off with Flying Tiger Line Flight 739. Flying Tiger Line Flight 739 was a Lockheed L-1049 Super Constellation aircraft that seemed to vanish on March 16th of 1962. The flight left from California, was en route to its final destination in Saigon. The plane was carrying 96 military passengers, but at some point during the flight it lost contact and disappeared from radar screens somewhere over the western Pacific Ocean. There was no wreckage or debris ever found. One possibility is that the plane exploded in midair, but without any remnants of the plane to look at, it's not clear exactly what would have caused that to happen. There's also the possibility that the aircraft deviated from its flight path because of some navigational error and then crashed in an area not covered in the search. There were also no distress calls to go off of, so to this day, the cause of the disappearance is still unknown. Next up on the list is Varig Flight 967. Varig Flight 967 was a commercial flight that mysteriously disappeared on January 30th of 1979 while en route from Tokyo to Rio de Janeiro. The plane was a Boeing 707-323C operated by the Brazilian airline Varig. It was mostly carrying cargo, $1.24 million worth of paintings by the Japanese-Brazilian painter Manobu Mabe. The flight had a scheduled layover in Los Angeles where it was going to pick up additional cargo and passengers, but it never landed in LA. There was a sudden loss of communication with air traffic control. Around 8 hours into the flight, the crew failed to establish radio contact during routine check-ins. No distress signals or emergency calls were ever received either. The aircraft just went silent. Finding this plane was like searching for a needle in a haystack. It went down somewhere in the vast Pacific Ocean. Search operations were carried out by both Brazilian and American authorities, but the wreckage of the flight was never found, and no signs of the cargo or 6 crew members ever been found either. Canadian Pacific Airlines Flight 3505. On July 21st of 1951, during a scheduled flight from Vancouver, Canada to Tokyo, the plane disappeared without a trace. The flight was carrying 31 passengers and 6 crew members. It left Vancouver International Airport at 6:35 with a planned stopover at Anchorage Airport in Alaska. The aircraft was on schedule, reporting its position at the Cape Spencer intersection in British Columbia, 90 minutes away from Anchorage, but the weather conditions in the area were apparently challenging. Heavy rain and icing, and visibility was low. Fortunately, after the last reported position, the plane went silent. The search efforts were eventually called off on October 31st of 1951. 6-member crew were all Canadians, while the 31 passengers included 2 Royal Canadian Navy sailors, 26 United States military members, and 3 civilian US citizens. But unfortunately, none of these passengers have ever been found. Next up, we have the Indian Air Force AN-32. In January of 2016, an Antonov AN-32 aircraft of the Indian Air Force had gone missing during a flight from Chennai to Port Blair in the Bay of Bengal. The flight, carrying 29 people on board, including 6 crew and 23 passengers, lost contact with air traffic control about 16 minutes after taking off. And of course, the plane never reached its destination. There was a widespread search and rescue operation, and after months of relentless efforts by Indian authorities with naval vessels, aircrafts, and satellite imagery to scour the Bay of Bengal, nothing turned up. The search covered extensive areas too, both on the surface of the water and beneath it. For a long time, it was assumed the wreckage would never be found, just another mysterious plane disappearance. But just recently, in January of this year, which at the time of recording this is 2024, the wreckage of the aircraft was finally discovered off the coast of Chennai. Fortunately, there were no survivors, unsurprisingly. Next on the list, we have Glenn Miller. So this is a famous big band leader who went missing on a flight during World War II. So Glenn Miller was a renowned American band leader, composer, and trombonist during the swing era of the 30s and 40s. But Miller had joined in the war effort, and on December 15th of 1944, Miller boarded a small UC-64 Norseman aircraft in England en route to France for a series of performances to entertain troops that were stationed there. But Miller's plane never reached its destination. Somewhere over the English Channel, the aircraft disappeared without a trace. The plane and remains of the passengers were never found. One theory is that the plane actually was shot down after receiving friendly fire from English planes, and this was then covered up. In the chaos at the time, it's very possible that Miller's plane might have been mistaken for an enemy craft. But there could have also just been mechanical failure or some other accident and the plane just went down, never to be found. Next up is the BSAA Stardust. On August 2nd of 1947, tragedy struck as the British South American Airways Lancastrian, known as Stardust, was on its way from Buenos Aires to Santiago, Chile. The aircraft crashed into Mount Tupungato in the Argentine Andes. The wreckage wasn't found for years, and it wasn't until the late 90s that fragments of the missing aircraft started to emerge from glacial ice. And then from the parts of the wreckage, researchers were able to figure out the crew must have become disoriented about their exact location, and mistakenly thinking they'd already cleared the mountaintops, they started their descent, not realizing they were still behind cloud-covered peaks. So then they crashed into the mountain. Everyone on board would have died, and the aircraft was buried beneath snow and ice. One of the mysteries about this case for a long time is the final Morse code transmission from Stardust to Santiago Airport. The last word, Stendek, was received 4 minutes before the scheduled landing, and it was repeated twice. The message most likely translates to severe turbulence encountered, now descending, emergency crash landing. And that's not the only plane that had an unfortunate run-in with the Andes Mountains. The Uruguayan Air Force Flight 571 incident, one of the most insane tales involving a plane in history. So in 1972, an aircraft carrying 45 passengers, including members of the Uruguayan rugby team, their friends and family, left from Uruguay to Santiago, Chile. As the aircraft approached the Andes, the plane crashed into the mountains. The impact instantly claimed the lives of several of the passengers, but there were survivors who now found themselves stranded. There was extreme cold and they had little to no food. They started to realize that there was a good chance they weren't going to be found, at least not anytime soon. And so in order to survive, some resorted to eating people who had already died, pretty grim, but two survivors made the decision to venture out in search of help. They traveled on foot for days until they finally encountered 3 men on horseback who were able to communicate with them for help. Finally, the remaining survivors were rescued on December 23rd, 1972. Next up on the list, we have Flight 19, probably the most famous Bermuda Triangle tale. So on December 5th of 1945, there was a group of 5 U.S. Navy Avenger torpedo bombers on a routine training mission. They took off from the Naval Air Station Fort Lauderdale in Florida for what they called Navigation Problem 1, basically a navigation exercise. Lieutenant Charles C. Taylor, a seasoned pilot, was leading the exercise. The plan was to fly east, turn north, and then head west back to the base. Not too far into the exercise though, Taylor radioed in, saying his compass was acting up. He was convinced they were off course, so Flight 19 started going in different directions, trying to figure out where they were. Their fuel started running low, and Taylor told the pilots to ditch their planes in the ocean because they couldn't find land. The last radio call comes in around 6:20 p.m. saying they're getting ready to bail out, and then silence. No distress signals, no emergency calls, just nothing. Flight 19 vanished into thin air, seemingly. And what's even crazier is that one of the search and rescue crafts, a flying boat, was then sent out to find the missing pilots, and that also disappeared. All 13 crew members were never seen or heard from again. And of course, no bits of Flight 19 or its crew have ever turned up. Just one of the many reasons the Bermuda Triangle is such an unsettling part of the world. Next, we have the infamous D.B. Cooper case. Gotta be one of the most stylish plane jackings of all time. So it's Thanksgiving Eve, and a regular dude, seemingly, who we'll later know as D.B. Cooper, hops on a Northwest Orient Airlines flight in Portland, Oregon. He's got a one-way ticket to Seattle. Cooper's dressed like a typical businessman, a suit, he's got a briefcase, and in that briefcase were explosives. He hands a note to a flight attendant claiming he's got explosives and wants $200,000 and some parachutes. He ends up getting the cash and parachutes he asked for. It takes a few hours of haggling, but eventually Cooper releases the 36 passengers in exchange for the ransom and the parachutes. Cooper instructs the remaining flight crew to head towards Mexico City at a low altitude, keeping the plane slow and with its landing gear down. The plan is to make a quiet escape. Somewhere over the rugged terrains of Washington State, in the middle of a storm, Cooper opens a rear stairway door and takes a leap into the pitch black darkness with his parachute and the ransom money. And that's the last anyone sees of him. The plane lands in Reno, and when they check, D.B. Cooper's no longer on board. It's still not known whether he actually survived the jump or not. He may have drowned, had an accident with his parachute, or he may have actually survived and gotten away with the whole thing. Still don't know for sure. And finally, we of course have Malaysia Airlines Flight 370. You knew this one was coming up. So on March 8th of 2014, the Boeing 777 carrying 239 passengers and crew seemingly vanished without a trace during its journey from Kuala Lumpur to Beijing. Just less than an hour after the takeoff, the aircraft disappeared from radar screens, leaving no distress signals or communication indicating that there were any issues. At first, the search for Flight 370 focused on the Gulf of Thailand and the South China Sea, where the last contact with air traffic control was made. But then it came out that the plane had made an abrupt turn, changing direction from its planned route, and flew for several hours before satellite data showed it likely went down in the southern Indian Ocean. All 227 passengers and 12 crew were presumed dead, and the incident became the deadliest involving a Boeing 777 and the deadliest in Malaysia Airlines history. That is until Malaysia Airlines Flight 17 was shot down over Ukraine just a few months later. Really bad year for Malaysia Airlines. The search for MH370 became the most expensive in aviation history. Several pieces of debris confirmed to be from the plane washed ashore in the western Indian Ocean in 2015 and 16, and there was a 3-year search covering 120,000 square kilometers of ocean. But the Joint Agency Coordination Center suspended its activities in January 2017 without having located the aircraft. There was also a second search in January of 2018 by private contractor Ocean Infinity, but they also came up empty-handed after 6 months. With all that said, I've been your host, James, and I will catch you, yes you specifically, in the next video.